In this 1898 family photograph, the toddler's tiny hand hides a dark secret. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses as she sorted through the cardboard boxes that had arrived at the Boston Medical History Archive that morning. The donation came from the estate of a woman who had passed away at 93, leaving behind generations of family documents, letters, and photographs. Sarah had spent 15 years as the archive's chief curator, and she had learned to approach each donation with equal parts curiosity and patience. The photographs were stored in a leather album, its cover cracked and faded. She carefully turned each page, documenting the images: wedding portraits, stern-faced men in suits, women in elaborate Victorian dresses. Then she reached a formal family photograph dated 1898 on the back in faded ink. A young couple stood rigidly, the woman seated with a toddler on her lap, the man standing behind them with his hand on her shoulder. Sarah almost moved on to the next page, but something caught her eye. She pulled the photograph closer, studying the child's hands. The toddler, no more than 2 years old, had both hands resting on the mother's arm, but there was something unusual about the skin. Even through the sepia tone and age of the photograph, Sarah could see distinct dark patches on the small fingers and the back of the right hand. She reached for her magnifying glass and examined the image more carefully. The patches weren't dirt or damage to the photograph itself. They were on the child's skin, symmetrical and distinctive. Sarah's breath caught. She had seen similar patterns before, in medical textbooks from her graduate studies. Her heart began to race as the implications formed in her mind. She turned the photograph over again. Written in careful script: The Anderson family, Boston, Massachusetts, October 1898. Below that, in different handwriting, fainter: Little Thomas, age 2. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. If what she suspected was true, this wasn't just a family photograph. It could be one of the earliest documented cases of a disease that would devastate America in the coming decades. She needed to verify her suspicions, trace the family's history, and understand what happened to little Thomas. She pulled out her research notebook and began to write, not knowing that this single photograph would consume the next 6 months of her life and reveal a tragedy that had remained hidden for over a century. Sarah spent the following week immersed in medical journals from the late 19th century. She spread references across her desk, cross-referencing symptoms and comparing clinical descriptions with what she could see in the photograph. The distinctive symmetrical lesions on Thomas's hands matched the early descriptions of pellagra, though the disease wouldn't be fully understood for another 2 decades. In 1898, pellagra was still relatively unknown in the United States. Medical professionals were only beginning to encounter cases, primarily among the poor and malnourished. Most doctors mistook it for leprosy, syphilis, or any number of skin conditions. The true cause, a severe deficiency of niacin, remained a mystery that would kill thousands before being discovered. Sarah contacted Dr. James Chen, a dermatologist at Massachusetts General Hospital who specialized in historical diseases. When she showed him the photograph, his reaction confirmed her suspicions. "Look at the distribution," he said, pointing to the child's hands with a pen. "Symmetrical on sun-exposed areas, and see here, on the backs of the hands. That rough, scaly texture even shows through the photograph. This is consistent with pellagra." Armed with this confirmation, Sarah turned her attention to finding the Anderson family. She started with Boston City directories from 1898, working her way through public records, census data, and church registries. The search was painstaking. Anderson was a common name, and many records from that era had been lost to fires, floods, or simple neglect. After days of searching, she found them. Robert Anderson, listed as a textile worker, living on Hanover Street in the North End, Boston's immigrant neighborhood. His wife was listed as Mary, and they had 1 child. The census taker had noted the family as recent arrivals, though their country of origin wasn't specified. Sarah's pulse quickened. Textile workers in 1898 earned barely enough to survive. The North End was overcrowded, unsanitary, and disease-ridden. If the Anderson family had been struggling with poverty and malnutrition, it would explain everything. Pellagra thrived in conditions of extreme deprivation where families survived on limited diets of cornmeal and little else. She needed to know more. What happened to Thomas? Did he survive? Did anyone recognize what was wrong with him? Sarah pulled out a map of historical Boston and marked the location of the Andersons' address, planning her next steps carefully. Sarah stood on Hanover Street on a cold February morning, looking up at the building that now occupied the Anderson family's former address. The original tenement had been demolished decades ago, replaced by a modern apartment complex, but the street itself still retained echoes of its immigrant past. Italian bakeries, small cafes, and old brick buildings lined the narrow road. She had spent the previous evening at the Boston Public Library, poring over newspapers from 1898 and 1899. The North End during that period was a study in hardship. Thousands of immigrants, Irish, Italian, Jewish, Eastern European, packed into cramped tenements with no running water, poor ventilation, and minimal sanitation. Disease was rampant: tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera. Children died regularly from malnutrition and preventable illnesses. In the library's archives, Sarah had found something significant: a report from the Boston Board of Health dated November 1898, just 1 month after the Anderson photograph was taken. The report documented an outbreak of mysterious skin afflictions among children in the North End, primarily affecting the poorest families. Doctors at the time attributed it to miasma and poor hygiene, completely missing the nutritional cause. Now, standing on the same street where the Andersons had lived, Sarah felt the weight of their struggle. She imagined Mary Anderson, holding her sick child, watching the lesions spread across his small hands, not understanding what was happening. She imagined Robert, working 12-hour shifts at the textile mill, bringing home barely enough money to buy bread and cornmeal, watching helplessly as his son deteriorated. Sarah walked to the North End Branch Library, where local historical records were kept. The librarian, an elderly man named Frank, greeted her warmly when she explained her research. "The North End has stories that would break your heart," he said, leading her to a back room filled with filing cabinets, especially from that era. He pulled out a folder labeled St. Leonard's Church Parish Records, 1890-1900. St. Leonard's had served the immigrant community, and their records were meticulous. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. There, on a page dated December 1898, she found it: a burial record for Thomas Anderson, age 2 years, cause of death listed as wasting disease and skin affliction. Sarah closed her eyes, grief washing over her for a child who had died over a century ago. Sarah knew she needed more than official records. She needed to understand the human story behind the statistics. She returned to the boxes from the estate donation, searching for anything that might have belonged to the Anderson family. Most of the items belonged to later generations, but tucked in the bottom of the third box, wrapped in faded tissue paper, she found a small leather journal. The cover was worn smooth, the pages yellowed and fragile. Sarah opened it carefully. The first page, written in delicate cursive, read, "Mary Anderson, her private thoughts, 1897. Sarah's heart raced. This was Mary's diary, the mother from the photograph. She carried the journal to her desk, put on cotton gloves, and began to read. The early entries were mundane. Notes about the weather, brief mentions of Robert's work at the mill, observations about their small apartment. But as Sarah progressed through 1898, the tone changed dramatically. March 15th, 1898. Thomas has been fussy these past days. He refuses to eat the cornmeal mush, though it's all we can afford. I try to give him milk when I can spare the pennies, but Robert's wages were cut again last month. May 2nd, 1898. I noticed strange marks on Thomas's hands today. Red patches, rough to the touch. I washed him thoroughly, thinking perhaps it was dirt from playing, but the marks remain. Mrs. O'Brien from downstairs says it might be from the poor air in these tenements. June 20th, 1898. The marks on Thomas's hands have grown worse. They're dark now, almost brown, and the skin is peeling. He cries when I touch them. I took him to the free clinic on Hanover Street. The doctor barely looked at him, said it was probably eczema, gave me a tin of salve. It does nothing. Sarah read on, her throat tightening with each entry. Mary's growing desperation filled the pages. She described taking Thomas to 3 different doctors, all of whom offered different diagnoses: eczema, ringworm, a hereditary condition. None recognized pellagra. None asked about the family's diet. August 10th, 1898. Thomas is getting weaker. He no longer plays. He sits in my lap, listless and pale. The patches have spread to his feet now. Robert works extra hours, but the money goes so quickly. We eat cornmeal and potatoes, sometimes bread if we can afford it. The entries became shorter, more fragmented, as Mary's exhaustion and fear grew. Sarah continued reading, and then she reached the entry that explained the photograph she had found. October 12, 1898. A photographer came to the North End today, offering portraits at a reduced price. Robert insisted we have a family photograph made. I protested. We can barely afford food. But he was adamant. We need something to remember, he said, though he wouldn't explain what he meant. I think he fears Thomas won't survive the winter. I fear it too, though I cannot say it aloud. October 15th, 1898. We went to the photographer's studio this morning. I dressed Thomas in his best clothes, though they hang loose on his thin frame. The photographer positioned us carefully. Robert standing, me seated with Thomas on my lap. I tried to hide Thomas's hands, ashamed of the lesions, but the photographer said, "Let them rest naturally." So I did. When the flash powder went off, Thomas startled and cried. The photographer was kind, though. He took 3 exposures to ensure we'd have a good image. Robert paid him 50 cents, money we desperately need for other things, but he seemed satisfied. He held my hand as we walked home and said, "Whatever happens, we'll have this." I didn't ask what he meant. Sarah sat back, wiping her eyes. Robert had known. He had insisted on the photograph because he understood his son was dying, and he wanted proof that Thomas had existed, that their small family had been real. She turned the page, dreading what would come next. November 3rd, 1898. Thomas can no longer walk. His legs are too weak. The lesions cover his hands and feet completely now, and new ones appear on his face. He's confused sometimes, doesn't recognize me for moments at a time. The doctor at City Hospital told me there's nothing more to be done. He said Thomas has a constitutional weakness and won't survive. November 18th, 1898. Thomas barely eats now. I try to give him broth, anything with nourishment, but he turns his face away. Mrs. O'Brien brought soup yesterday, made with real chicken. Thomas took 3 spoonfuls before falling asleep. It's the most he's eaten in days. December 1, 1898. Last night I held Thomas in my arms while he struggled to breathe. Robert sat beside us, his hand on Thomas's head. At 3 in the morning, our son took his last breath. He was 2 years and 7 months old. Sarah closed the diary, unable to continue. She sat in the silent archive, crying for a mother who had lost her child to a preventable disease over a century ago. After composing herself, Sarah knew she had to continue. This wasn't just about one family's tragedy anymore. If Thomas Anderson had died from pellagra in 1898, there must have been other cases. The disease didn't strike randomly. It followed patterns of poverty and malnutrition. She returned to the Boston Board of Health records, this time searching more systematically. She created a spreadsheet documenting every report of unusual skin conditions, wasting diseases, or unexplained child deaths in the North End between 1897 and 1900. The pattern that emerged was devastating. Over those 3 years, the health department had recorded 47 cases of mysterious skin afflictions in children under 5, concentrated almost entirely in the poorest immigrant neighborhoods. 31 of those children had died. The symptoms described in the reports matched pellagra almost perfectly. Symmetrical skin lesions, weakness, digestive problems, mental confusion in advanced stages. But none of the doctors had made the connection. None had thought to ask about diet. The prevailing medical theory of the time blamed disease on bad air, poor hygiene, or hereditary weakness. The idea that a simple vitamin deficiency could cause such suffering hadn't yet entered medical consciousness. Sarah contacted Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, a nutritional historian at Harvard Medical School. When she shared her findings, Patricia's response was immediate. "This is exactly what we'd expect," she said over the phone. Immigrant families in that era survived on whatever was cheapest. Cornmeal was abundant and inexpensive, so it became a staple. But a diet based almost entirely on untreated corn causes pellagra. It's the classic pattern. "Why didn't anyone see it?" Sarah asked. "Because pellagra wasn't officially recognized in the United States until the early 1900s, Patricia explained. And even then, it took decades to understand the cause. Joseph Goldberger didn't prove the nutritional link until 1915. By then, thousands had died. Your Thomas Anderson was just one of the invisible victims." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. These deaths were preventable. A varied diet, meat, vegetables, dairy, would have saved Thomas and dozens of other children. But poverty had condemned them. She scheduled a meeting with Patricia for the following week, determined to document this forgotten epidemic thoroughly. While waiting for her meeting with Patricia, Sarah continued examining the estate donation. She found a small wooden box containing letters, most addressed to someone named Margaret, dated between 1899 and 1920. She began reading and quickly realized these were letters from Robert Anderson to his sister. The first letter, dated January 1899, was written in a shaky hand. "Dear Margaret, I write to tell you that Mary and I have lost our son Thomas. He passed on the 1st of December after months of terrible suffering. The doctors could not help him. They said his constitution was weak, but I know it was more than that. We were so poor, Margaret. We could barely feed him. I worked every hour I could, but it was never enough. Mary blames herself, though it's not her fault. It's this city, this life we're trapped in. I don't know how to go on." Sarah's hands trembled as she continued reading. Robert's letters over the following years painted a portrait of a man destroyed by grief and guilt. He changed jobs frequently, never settling, always searching for something, perhaps redemption, perhaps understanding. Then, in a letter dated March 1902, Sarah found something unexpected. "Dear Margaret, I have been reading medical journals at the public library. I needed to understand what killed Thomas. I found an article about a disease called pellagra, common in Italy and parts of the southern United States. The symptoms match exactly what Thomas suffered. The skin lesions, the weakness, the mental confusion at the end. The article says it's caused by poor diet, specifically a lack of certain nutrients found in meat and fresh vegetables. Margaret, we killed our son with poverty, not intentionally, but the result is the same. If we had been able to afford proper food, he would be alive today, playing, laughing. Instead, we fed him cornmeal and water because that's all we could afford. I carry this knowledge like a stone in my chest." Sarah read on, following Robert's journey of understanding. He became obsessed with nutrition and public health, attending free lectures, reading everything he could find. In 1905, he began volunteering at a settlement house, helping newly arrived immigrant families understand the importance of varied diet. "I cannot bring Thomas back," he wrote in 1907, "but perhaps I can prevent other fathers from standing where I stood, watching their children waste away from preventable suffering." Sarah learned that Robert had kept the family photograph on his desk for the rest of his life, a reminder of what poverty cost. Sarah's meeting with Dr. Patricia Rodriguez expanded into a full research collaboration. Patricia brought in colleagues from public health, nutrition science, and medical history. Together, they began mapping the hidden pellagra epidemic that had swept through America's immigrant communities at the turn of the century. Using Sarah's initial findings as a starting point, the team examined health records from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. The pattern was consistent across all cities: clusters of unexplained deaths among the poorest children, concentrated in neighborhoods where corn-based diets were standard. "Look at this," Patricia said during one of their working sessions, pointing to a chart she'd created. "Deaths from wasting disease spike in late winter and early spring, exactly when poor families would have exhausted any summer vegetables they'd preserved. By spring, they're surviving on cornmeal, potatoes, and little else." The team found that doctors of the era had created elaborate theories to explain the deaths, everything from constitutional weakness to immigrant susceptibility to disease. Some even blamed the victims, suggesting that immigrant families lacked proper parenting knowledge or hygiene. None recognized the simple truth. These children were starving for specific nutrients while their stomachs were full of cornmeal. Sarah presented their preliminary findings at the New England Medical History Conference in April. The response was overwhelming. Other researchers came forward with similar discoveries from different cities, different immigrant populations. What Sarah had uncovered with Thomas Anderson's photograph was part of a national tragedy that had been hiding in plain sight for over a century. A journalist from the Boston Globe attended the presentation and approached Sarah afterward. "This is an important story," she said. "Would you be willing to be interviewed?" Sarah hesitated, thinking of the Anderson family, of Mary's private grief recorded in her diary. But then she thought of Robert, who had spent his later years trying to prevent other families from suffering the same loss. "Yes," Sarah said, "but I want to make sure we tell it right. This isn't just about medical history. It's about how poverty kills and how we failed to see it." The article ran 2 weeks later, with the 1898 Anderson family photograph prominently displayed. The Boston Globe article generated unexpected responses. Sarah received dozens of emails and phone calls, but one stood out. A woman named Jennifer called the archive, her voice shaking as she explained that she believed she might be Thomas Anderson's relative. Sarah met Jennifer at a coffee shop near the archive. Jennifer was in her 50s, a teacher from suburban Boston, and she brought with her a box of family documents. "My grandmother's maiden name was Anderson," Jennifer explained. "She always said her family came from the North End, but she rarely talked about her early life. After reading the article, I went through her papers and found this." She handed Sarah a faded photograph. It showed an elderly Robert Anderson, probably in his 70s, standing in front of a settlement house with a group of immigrant children. On the back, in the same handwriting Sarah recognized from the letters, "Robert Anderson, 1935, still trying to make amends." "He was my great-great-grandfather," Jennifer said quietly. "I never knew he'd lost a child. My grandmother never mentioned Thomas." Over the next hour, Jennifer shared what she knew. After Thomas's death, Robert and Mary had never had another child. Mary had died in 1918 during the influenza pandemic. Robert had lived until 1943, dedicating his later years to public health advocacy and immigrant assistance. "He kept that photograph," Jennifer said, pulling out another item from her box. It was the same 1898 family portrait Sarah had found, but this copy was in better condition, with a small inscription on the frame. "Thomas Robert Anderson, 2 years old, never forgotten." Sarah showed Jennifer the diary entries, watching as the younger woman read her great-great-grandmother's words. Tears streamed down Jennifer's face as she absorbed Mary's fear, love, and helplessness. "She loved him so much," Jennifer whispered, "and she couldn't save him." "No," Sarah said gently. "The poverty saved him. The system that kept them trapped saved him. Your great-great-grandparents did everything they could." Jennifer looked up, her eyes red. "Can I help with your research? I want people to know Thomas's story. I want his life to mean something." Sarah nodded, grateful. Together, they would ensure that Thomas Anderson and the dozens of other children who died invisible deaths would finally be remembered. 6 months after finding the photograph, Sarah stood in the Boston Medical History Archives exhibition hall, looking at the display she and her team had created. The centerpiece was the 1898 Anderson family photograph, enlarged and professionally restored, with Thomas's small hands and their telltale lesions clearly visible. Surrounding it were other photographs they'd uncovered, documents from health departments, excerpts from Mary's diary, and Robert's letters. The exhibition was titled "Hidden Hunger: The Forgotten Pellagra Epidemic in America's Immigrant Communities, 1890-1920. But this wasn't just a historical display. Sarah had worked with Patricia and a team of public health experts to create a companion section highlighting modern nutritional deficiencies. The parallels were striking. Children in food deserts today, families choosing between rent and fresh vegetables, the return of diseases of poverty that were supposed to have been eradicated. Jennifer attended the opening, bringing her 2 teenage daughters. "This is your ancestor," she told them, pointing to Thomas in the photograph. "He died because society failed him. We honor him by making sure it doesn't happen to other children." The exhibition drew visitors from across the country. Medical students came to learn about the history of nutritional science. Social workers used it as a teaching tool. Families saw their own struggles reflected in Mary and Robert's story. A representative from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health approached Sarah during the opening reception. "We'd like to use this research to support our childhood nutrition programs," she said. "Sometimes people need to understand the historical cost of inaction." Sarah looked back at the photograph of Thomas, his small face solemn in his mother's lap, his marked hands resting trustingly on her arm. He had been dead for over 125 years, but his image had finally fulfilled the purpose Robert had intended when he insisted on that photograph, to prove that Thomas had existed, that his life mattered, and that his death demanded recognition. That evening, Sarah returned to her office and wrote a final entry in her research journal. Thomas Robert Anderson died on December 1, 1898, from pellagra caused by severe nutritional deficiency. He was 2 years and 7 months old. His death was preventable. His suffering was unnecessary. His memory is now permanent. May we learn from what killed him, and may we never stop fighting the poverty that still kills children today. She closed the journal and turned off the light, leaving the archive in darkness. But Thomas's story would now shine forward, a small hand reaching across more than a century to remind the living of their obligations to the most vulnerable.